All right, we should probably get started. I know that things ran late this morning. We had the choir warming up in here this morning too. It was very exciting for those of you who were here. So we should get started. Well, as you may have seen from headlines and happenings, after a long journey down the yellow brick road where we reached Jesus, just to point ahead to what we're going to talk about today, we'll be talking about the way Jesus is portrayed in the Gospel of Matthew, and it's going to be obviously highly abbreviated because you can't do the whole thing, with a little addendum from the Gospel of John. Then next week we're going to do the Apostle Paul, and then after Easter we'll return to Jesus one more time, another set of teachings about him, and to ask whether or not Jesus is anti-Jewish, actually, or could be used as anti-Jewish. So we'll look at other passages when we get to that point. But today we're just trying to see what Jesus looks like in light of the history of Israel that we've talked about thus far, right? So so far we've looked at the covenant made with Abraham. We've looked at the covenant made through Moses that is renewed actually with the scribe Ezra in a rather dramatic way after the exile. We've looked at the covenant made with David, which includes the promise that David, or the Davidic king, will reign in Jerusalem forever, and that the Davidic king will never be defeated, that he'll always get the better of his enemies. And we've also looked at the relationship of the Davidic king to the temple, right? And so the temple was the main thing David wanted to build. That's where that promise comes to him, is God knows he wants to build a temple for God, and God says, you're not going to build it. We learn elsewhere that it's because his hands are bloody. He killed so many people. His son Solomon, who's a king of peace, will build it, etc. But then God promises to love David's son forever and never withhold God's steadfast love from the son, which is why the son would never be defeated, or the sons would never be defeated. And then finally, we saw in the return from the exile the importance of two institutions in particular that come to be combined, because we noticed with Jeremiah that the people were indicted for going with the temple and the presence of God in the temple, even in light of their disobedience to the law, rather flagrant disobedience to the law. So when they return, they rebuild the temple. So the temple is still central to Israelite life after the return from exile, but they also then institute the teaching and doing and studying of the law, right? So the law of Moses assumes a very central place in Jewish and Israelite life during this period. And Ezra is really kind of the main, he is the main person bringing this about. And then we saw during the persecutions under Antiochus Epiphanes and then under Pilate, the Jews, not all of them, but pious Jews, and there were, according to Josephus, tens of thousands of them, were willing to die for the sake of their laws rather than disobey the law of God given through Moses. And that's really impressive. And you can see an influence of those martyr stories. It's kind of an interesting period because Socrates influences the way the martyr stories, including Jesus, get told, especially in the Gospel of Luke. Socrates is a major influence in the crucifixion scene there. And then the Jewish martyrs influence the way the New Testament authors think about Jesus and the disciples, right? So you have this very rich kind of mutual influence going on. It's important, as I said, also to note that martyrdom was not the ideal, and never was the ideal in the Jewish community, and still is not. You should be willing to die for the sake of the law, but the law is not given to you so that you die for it. And we'll see a real difference with the Jesus movement at that point in particular. So, but when push comes to shove, you should be willing to lay down your life for the law. And it's interesting that the willingness of the Jews to do this during the Roman period really changed the rulers of Rome's hearts, the proximate rulers, like the procurator types. When Pilate is going to kill them because they won't let the Caesar's ensigns, this is at the time of Jesus, they won't let the Caesar's ensigns be put in the temple. The people say that, well, go ahead and kill us, we're willing to die. And Pilate's like, oh, that's like, okay, we'll take them away, we won't put them in. And so, similarly, later on, when Caligula wants his statue placed in the temple in Jerusalem, the Jews go to, oh God, what's his name? I can't remember his name right now. But anyway, the ruler who's the military person who's supposed to impose that by war, they go to him and tell him, go ahead and kill us, but we're not going to let you do that voluntarily. And so this nonviolent resistance, I mean, it really is a nonviolent resistance movement, starts around 165 before the Common Era. And it's a willingness to use martyrdom for the sake of the law, right? And it worked. It didn't work under Antiochus, right? He actually wound up killing them. But the Romans, for some reason, found that to be very moving and didn't, in fact, at that time, kill them to instate idolatry in the temple in Jerusalem. But that also tells you just how tightly related these things are. Law, temple, right? That's the third rail of Jewish identity during this time. And so that's what I was trying to get across, is before it sounded like the temple was more important, at least Jeremiah thought. People thought the temple was more important and the law wasn't. But now the law and the temple are so intertwined that people are willing to die rather than let the temple be defiled or the law be disobeyed. So that's a very important thing to see. So that sets the table for Jesus of Nazareth, right, who we're going to look at for the next few weeks. And this is, of course, ridiculous to try to do this in a few weeks with some handouts, but it's just to give us an idea what he would look like, because what the forum is really meant to do is get us to put Israelite glasses on, and so to look at what we see with that in mind. Like, what would an Israelite of this time make of Jesus, right? Not what we would make of Jesus, or what would subsequent Christians make of him, but what would an Israelite think was going on when they heard these stories, right? And so the opening one, and again, these are highly abbreviated passages, so I could fit enough on to a two-sided sheet, but the opening of every single gospel isn't the infant narrative. It's interesting, the Christmas narratives only show up in Matthew and Luke. John does not have an infancy narrative, and Mark does not have an infancy narrative. So Jesus' life, according to the Gospels, begins with his baptism by John. Even in the book of Acts, when they summarize who should replace Judas after he killed himself, it was someone who was with Jesus from the baptism of John until his resurrection, right? So they don't say somebody who grew up with him in Nazareth, right? They say somebody who was with him from the baptism of John onward. And so that's why I thought we'd begin with the baptism of John. And I've highly abbreviated it, but it's for the sake of what happens at the end of it. So just to start with Matthew 3:1 on the page there. In those days, John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness of Judea. So wilderness, what does wilderness remind you of? The Exodus, right? So John goes out to the place through which the Exodus came, right? So there's almost there is a sense that when you go out to the wilderness, you're going to renew Israel, right? The wilderness is a place of renewal. Also, the wilderness shows up again, you see it especially in 2nd Isaiah, Israel is going to have to pass through the wilderness to get back to Jerusalem. And so, and 2nd Isaiah and Jeremiah both say, forget about the Exodus. This is what you should remember from now on. Not the return from Egypt, but the return from Babylon. So the wilderness is also a return symbol in the subsequent history, in the return from Babylon, which would be much closer to the time of John the Baptist and Jesus than the Exodus. But the Exodus is remembered every year. Jesus' life ends in Jerusalem during Passover, which is the commemoration of the Exodus. So they're both really tightly related here. So just the opening sentence tells you a lot, right? If you're thinking in an Israelite way. In the wilderness of Judea proclaiming, repent. Turn around or change your mind, right? And that sounds like Jeremiah. That sounds especially like Jeremiah, actually, and other prophets, Jonah. For the kingdom of heaven has come near. Now that's a new theme. We didn't look at that, right? What is the kingdom of heaven? We'll talk about that as we go along, but it's a really interesting idea. It's God's kingdom. It's not the Davidic kingdom. But we'll see the Davidic kingdom is very much in play in these texts as well. So we'll just have to see how the kingdom of heaven appears in these texts. So repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. And as you know, people repent and they confess their sins and they're baptized by John in the Jordan. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan. So Jesus travels all the way down from Galilee. If you've been to Israel, you know the topography. That's a long walk from Galilee, which is way up north, to the Jordan, where John is working basically due east of Jerusalem, down in the Dead Sea Valley. We think, somewhere in there. So anyway, Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. This also tells us something. Who's the follower of whom? Jesus is a follower of John the Baptist, right? And of course in Matthew, John objects to this. Like, I should be baptized by you. What are you doing having me baptize you instead? I kept that out just for the sake of time, but it's important to note. And so, and what is baptism? As an Israelite, what's baptism? No idea. It hasn't occurred before, right? There is ritual immersion, very widely practiced during this time, especially if you're a woman who's gone through her menstrual cycle. You are not to have relations with your husband until that's over, and then until you're purified. And so you strip naked and you go in the mikvah to wash away all the impurity. It's not actually a view of hygienic purity, it's ritual purity, which is really important. Actually, ritual purity is very important, but they're not bathing to get rid of bacteria. We didn't even know about bacteria until the late 19th century. But so it's a ritual, so there's a ritual bath. Also, converts during this time, to this day, especially if you convert to the Orthodox tradition, you, as an idolater, which a Gentile would be, your last move is to strip naked and go in the mikvah, in the ritual bath, to wash off all your idolatry, and also probably your sexual sins. Gentiles were known for two things in particular: idolatry and sexual misconduct, right? So if you want to know what the Jewish tradition thought about our ancestors, those are the two things. So there is that sense that water can wash away the impurities of your life, the sins of your life. And so that may be what John was extending, but we don't really know where baptism comes from. But Jesus is baptized by John, which is really interesting. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him. That happens a lot in the New Testament. It doesn't really happen in the Hebrew Bible, so it's a very interesting move. But it also happens in Jewish thought outside of the New Testament as well. There's this idea that the heavens open and God speaks. The heavens were opened to him, and he saw this, and he, being John, saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." So we're Israelites now. What does that mean? God says, "This is my Son." Now, as Christians, we have a whole bunch of interpretation of what that means. We confess it every Sunday, right? But what, as an Israelite who doesn't have the Nicene or Apostles' Creed, what does that mean? What is God saying? This is my Son. About whom did God say that before? Pardon me? David, right? This is the beloved this is the beloved Son of David. And we're told this in the opening of the Gospel. Matthew, I didn't include it, but Matthew says the gospel of Jesus Christ, the son of Abraham, the son of David. Right? So we're already told he's the son of David. But now God's telling us he's God's son, the chosen one, the beloved one, with whom I am well pleased. So the Son, as we know from the promise made to David in 1 or 2 Samuel 7, God's love rests especially on David and on his descendants, and God will never remove God's steadfast love from David or from his descendants, and God will even forgive them if they sin and not remove that love the way God did from Saul. So it's a very important opening, right? He's baptized by John, which in a way you could view as his anointing, right? He's not anointed with oil, but he could be seen as being anointed with water and with the Spirit. That should sound familiar to us, right? And he's the Son. God declares that he's the Son. Yes?
Is that when Jesus became divine? I mean, there's so little we know about Jesus before this particular time.
Well, the question is...
I think there would be some miracles somewhere as Jesus is growing up.
But there are. The Gospel of Thomas tells miracle stories when he was younger. But anyway, yes?
If you did believe that, you wouldn't have to be concerned with the virgin birth.
If you believe what?
If you believe that when God said, "This is beloved, this is my son," when Jesus was baptized, that's when he became divine.
Or did he become divine? I mean, did David become divine when he was declared to be the Son of God? I mean, we're thinking of Israel. I'm not saying that the New Testament isn't also pushing this idea of Son of God in another direction, but hearing this from an Israelite point of view, would you think that a human being is divine? Like, didn't Antiochus Epiphanes, which means God manifest, by the way, he was considered to be the most arrogant human being that ever lived, and it's because he called himself God manifest. In fact, at the end of his life, because of that blasphemy, they say he was eaten with worms, right? And that occurs later in the book of Acts, right? One of the Herodian kings gave a speech, and the way the light reflected off of him gave him this kind of divine aura. And this is in the book of Acts of the Apostles, right? And the people say, the voice of a God, not a human being, and worms ate him, right? So to say that a human being is divine ends badly. So I'm not sure an Israelite would want to think that David's son was divine, or would even have to think that. But it's a really good question. So is he divine the whole time, right? And people just don't know it. That's one way of looking at it. And I'm not saying this would not be a possible way of interpreting this passage, but from an Israelite point of view, would you think this is my son means he's divine? And I just don't see how that would be possible, because the people who thought they were divine got eaten with worms, right? So, which is a very grisly way to go. So, it's a really good question. How do they respond to Jesus, and do they in fact think that he's claiming to be divine? He may be, actually. I'm not sure that this passage, and I'm not arguing against that. I'm just saying I'm not sure this passage is saying that. It's saying, it's at least saying this is David's son, and this is the son, my son, with whom I am well pleased. So we'll keep this in mind, though. It's a really important question. The Gospel of John, by the way, pushes that issue of the divinity of Christ much further than Matthew does. Like, it's just almost out of the gate that he pushes it, and in a very provocative way. Jesus will say things like, before Abraham was, I am, and he's using the divine name that's revealed to Moses. So the early community is clearly pushing this in that direction. So I'm not arguing against that at all. I'm just saying I'm not sure Matthew is doing that here. He might be, but I don't think he's doing that here. So then the next scene I have, and we're jumping along a bit, is Matthew 5, but it's the Sermon on the Mount. So we have this scene when Jesus saw the crowds, which is interesting. So there are a lot of people. He went up the mountain, and after his disciples, after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them. Where are we now? If you're an Israelite, you're up a mountain. Somebody's standing there in front of a whole crowd teaching. Moses. And who else? Up on a wooden platform outside the temple. Ezra, right? So, and Ezra taught what? Moses, right? So Moses taught the people what God told him. Ezra told the people what God told Moses, right? And wanted them to study and do and teach Moses. So Jesus goes up the mountain and teaches, right? So what would you expect him to teach if you're an Israelite? Moses, right? And so I jumped ahead. I jumped ahead from the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are really important, but I just jumped ahead to see what Jesus says about the law of Moses in the Sermon on the Mount. And you get different pictures of what he would say. So, but it's really important to see, if you're an Israelite with a good memory and you see this kind of event, it's like, oh, Moses, Ezra, right? So Jesus is intentionally linking himself up with those two, at least those two. But Ezra taught Moses. Moses taught what God told him. When he went up and sat down and his disciples came to him, then he began to speak and taught them, saying, and I jumped ahead several verses, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. So whatever he's saying, it is not forget about Moses, right? But it's also not just continue on, it's to fulfill Moses and the prophets. So it's hard to know exactly what that means, but it certainly means I did not come to abolish the law. We'll look next week at Paul to see if Paul agrees with that. But anyway, I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass away from the law until all is accomplished. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, I mentioned before, the Pharisees are a lay group that took it upon themselves to study and teach the law of Moses and give it their own interpretation through an oral law that they claim Moses also taught along with the written law. And that becomes taken up into the rabbinic movement after the time of Jesus also. So the Pharisees are a group that's very similar to the rabbis, but also different in ways. But look at this. This is really interesting that not only did I not teach I'm not teaching the abolition of the law, I'm strengthening the law. Unless your righteousness exceeds those who study the law, like the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. There's that term again, right? So the kingdom of heaven is something you're going to enter. It's not something that's going to be built. It's something that's coming, and the question is, are you going in or are you not getting in, right? And unless your righteousness exceeds the scribes and the Pharisees, you're not getting in. We see this next in the passage on adultery. We could also look at, we'll look at divorce as well. And I brought these in mainly because they have some very interesting things to say. So Jesus says, you have heard it said, you have heard that it was said, notice the passive voice, it was said, rather than who said it, you shall not commit adultery. So here's an extra credit question. Who said that? God. God says that directly to the people of Israel from above Mount Sinai. It's the Ten Commandments. You shall not commit adultery. You have heard that it was said. It sounds like a rumor getting passed along, right? Or somebody thought up a teaching. Oh, somebody said you shall not commit adultery. It's really strange. The more I thought about this sentence, the stranger it gets. This is something God didn't say this through Moses. God said this to the people directly, and afterwards they say, don't do that anymore. You talk to Moses, don't talk to us anymore. So that's one reason the Ten Commandments become elevated, not because they're the only commandments, but because they're the ones spoken directly to the people. So it's a very strange way to put it. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, so you're besting God? But I say to you, this isn't something that some Pharisee came up with on a lark. God says this directly to the people, and Jesus says, well, hey, you've heard that, but I say to you, right, that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And of course, Jimmy Carter made this passage incredibly famous in his Playboy interview. What a wonderful man. That's sad to see him go. But he took this passage very seriously, right? It isn't enough just to not commit adultery the way Moses or God through Moses taught or God himself taught. It's also even looking at a woman with desire or lust means you've committed adultery with her, right? And again, our righteousness has to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees or we're doomed, okay? Then so to elevate the importance of this, he says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Where'd hell come from? We've not heard about hell before, right? People think Jesus is a really nice guy. Really? I mean, it's scary, right? So the alternative of having your righteousness exceed the scribes and the Pharisees is being thrown into hell. So what image do you have when you think of hell? What's the climate? Hot, right? There's a valley right outside of Jerusalem, on the west side of Jerusalem, called the Valley of the Son of Hinnom, Ben Hinnom, where the Israelites, and Jeremiah talks about this, where the Israelites, during Jeremiah's day, burnt their children to Molech, one of the gods of the neighboring people, to try to win Molech's favor. So they're worshiping another god, and they're doing it by burning their children. And that became the Valley of Ben Hinnom, which then became Gehenna, which then became hell. So hell is named after the valley outside of Jerusalem, the old city, walled city of Jerusalem, where the Israelites burnt their children alive, right, as a sacrifice to God. So it's fire, right? He calls it later in Matthew 25 an eternal fire. Whether you're going to burn there eternally is another question, but the fire itself is eternal. So it's better to lose your eye, to tear out your eye, than to be thrown into hell. So that's a new thing, right? We didn't, the martyrs under Antiochus didn't say, and by the way, Antiochus, you're going to hell, or go to hell, right? That's what we say as kids. But it's more, we're going to be raised from the dead and you're not. But here it's going to be, no, you're not only are you not going to be raised from the dead, you're going to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. So the hell is not just a place your soul goes. You're thrown body and soul into hell, right? And then he goes on and says, but that's pretty dramatic, right? So we have several ideas that we haven't seen before. Baptism is one. And now I say to you, I can't imagine anyone after Moses saying, well, that's nice, but I say to you, right? And then if your eye or your hand causes you to violate what I just said to you, cut it off or pluck it out, right? Because otherwise your whole body and soul will be thrown into hell. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Who said that? We didn't read it. Who would you guess? Moses. Karen, you're right. Yeah, Moses. And who told Moses to say that? God. Right, so this is the teaching of God through Moses. So it's almost the same thing as the Ten Commandments, right? And this is still Jewish law, that the husband divorces the wife. Notice the wife doesn't get to divorce her husband. It's just an incredibly complex spiritual, psychological, emotional reality if you're a woman who wants a divorce in an Orthodox Jewish marriage. How do you get a divorce, right? You have to basically talk your husband into it. But still, it was also said by God through Moses, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, think about how that would come across. God through Moses said this, and now I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, and it's hard to know exactly, porneia is the word, hard to know exactly what that means, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. I'm an adulterer, right? I don't even have to go the Jimmy Carter route. I married a divorced woman, she married a divorced man, right? So what do we do with this? But anyway, it's a real issue. But look at the intensification here, right? No divorce whatsoever. And they ask him later, I was going to include this, but I wanted to look at the Sabbath instead. But they ask him later, what do you mean Moses allowed us to get a divorce? And he said, well, Moses did that for your hardness of heart, but in the beginning it was not so. God made man and woman, and they become one flesh, and whatever God has joined together, let no one rend asunder. And so he goes back, it's a really good argument. Actually, the rabbis will argue in a similar way. You take a passage from the Torah, you go to another passage from the Torah that seems to trump it, and you come up with a conclusion. That's actually a very Jewish rabbinic argument that Jesus makes in that passage on divorce later on. But here it's just straight up, I say to you, right? Moses said that, God said that, but I say to you something else, right? So it's really, you can just imagine how this came across. Imagine Ezra saying, Moses told you blah, 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 but I say to you, right? They would just be like, where are you getting off doing that? Which then raises the question, what kind of authority is he exercising here, right? What kind of claim is he making about himself? Who can correct Moses? And that's what he's doing. He's either tightening Moses, which is actually the rabbis call this putting a fence around the Torah to make sure that you don't disobey it, even the appearance of disobedience. So that could be one thing he's doing. But in another sense, he's teaching something entirely new. Moses says you can get divorced. I say you can't, right? So it's really, and you see that then at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus had finished saying those things, the crowds were astounded. They were gobsmacked, right? They were just like stunned at his teaching, For he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes. Right? How would a scribe teach? Well, Moses said this. How do we apply it here? Right? And I give you an example. Moses said, do no work on the Sabbath. Under the persecution under the Greek Seleucid rulers, there were Jews who wanted to observe the Sabbath, and they went down from Jerusalem into a cave down there toward the Dead Sea and rested from work. And somebody ratted them out, and they went in and burned them in the cave, right? And they wouldn't fight back because fighting is work. Okay, well, the one interpretation that started right then is, okay, that's it. The Sabbath is given for life. You can't enforce the Sabbath if it means you're killing people, and therefore, if you're attacked on the Sabbath, for God's sake, defend yourself. But you cannot start a battle on the Sabbath. But you can defend yourself on the Sabbath, right? So that would be the way a scribe would argue. But a scribe would not say, well, I say to you, fight. It would be, you'd have to be very careful about, well, the Sabbath was given for life. It would be a very nuanced argument. So it's really interesting. You can see right away there's something different going on with Jesus than there was with anyone we've seen prior. Even if he is the beloved son. I mean, David would not do that. David would not say, well, that's nice that God said that, but I say to you this. So it's really interesting, very provocative. And so when you're thinking as an Israelite, which is what I was trying to get us to do, he's provocative, right? He's very provocative and unsettling and disturbing. And then you get to the controversy about the Sabbath in chapter 12. He left that place and entered their synagogue. And as we talked about last time, the synagogue probably was an institution that started in Babylon, spread throughout the whole Jewish diaspora. It's basically a meeting place, but it was also used to teach and study the law of Moses once a week. So during the Sabbath, you'd go to synagogue, as is done today, and hear the law and probably the prophets read. And we talked last time about how Paul goes into a synagogue, and they read the law, and then they read the prophets, and then they say, does anyone have a word, right? And so that Jesus goes into the synagogue, nothing terribly surprising, but now we know it's a Sabbath, because he's going into the synagogue. A man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, is it lawful to cure on the Sabbath? So that they might accuse him. So they're trying to trap him. So they know he's up to something. Right? He's up to something. He's saying things like, I say to you, Moses said that, God said that, I say to you. So they want to see, okay, how are you going to handle the Sabbath? It's important to realize, though, and this is something Christians don't realize, that during this period, there's still a lot of argument about what the Sabbath would mean and what work means. Like, is it work to defend yourself on the Sabbath? Well, they conclude no, because love yourself, love your neighbor as yourself. Love yourself means defend yourself, and that trumps the Sabbath commandment to rest. So now you have a conundrum. If somebody shows up with a withered hand, what do? Well, is a withered hand is somebody in acute distress if they have a withered hand? No, it's a chronic condition, right? So should you violate the Sabbath to heal a chronic condition? Or should you wait till the next day? Well, the person's had it for a long time, maybe the whole life, right? So why wouldn't you wait till the next day? But maybe you should act right on that day, right? So this is the conundrum. And the rabbis actually debate this. So Jesus is very much within the debates that are going on during his day. And they asked him, is it lawful to cure or not? He said to them, suppose one of you had only one sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Right? Is that applicable? Is a sheep falling into a pit on the Sabbath the same thing as a withered hand? But it's not, right? The sheep falling in the pit is a crisis, right? You have to solve the problem right now. You can't wait till tomorrow to get it out. But the withered hand, you could wait. But Jesus is saying, and it's a really important argument, any affliction that a human being suffers should be cured right there when it presents itself, regardless of whether it's a Sabbath. That's not a bad argument, because the Sabbath is given for life, which is the principle that led them to think from the earlier on that you should defend yourself on the Sabbath. So at this point, he's not actually saying forget about the Sabbath the way subsequent Christians did. I mean, we haven't observed the Sabbath since a long time ago, right? And it was a mark of honor that Christians don't observe the Sabbath. But it looks like Jesus is not saying that. He's not saying who cares about the Sabbath. He's saying healing someone is more important than claiming you're not doing any work, right? And how much more valuable is a human being than an animal? But the rabbis would counter, his opponents would counter, you could have waited till tomorrow. So you're doing this just to provoke us, right? And so he said to the man, stretch out your hand, which is not work, by the way. He stretched it out, and it was restored, as sound as the other. But notice Jesus doesn't do anything. He doesn't pick up mud and make a plaster or something like that and apply it to him. That would be work. He does that elsewhere in other Sabbath stories, but he doesn't do that here. The man just holds his hand out and it's healed, right? But then the Pharisees went out and conspired against him how to destroy him. Right, so there's something he's doing with regard to the Sabbath, which is a very important time in post-exilic, especially post-exilic life, that Jesus seems to be disturbing or even threatening. But he would say, and I think there are Jewish interpreters of the New Testament today who would say, no, this is a legitimate argument, right? Can you heal on the Sabbath a chronic disease or not? And Jesus is saying, absolutely. Because if you pull a sheep out of a pit, how much more would you heal a fellow human being? So it's hard to say if this is so provocative that you'd want to kill him, right? But for some reason the Pharisees, and this happens in every gospel, his teaching about the Sabbath leads the Pharisees to want to kill him. Why? I mean, it's a really, really interesting question. All right, so then we come to, and we're probably not going to get through all this. I should have known better, right? So these are all about the law, and you can see though Jesus is not safe. Like, he's not a known entity. He's doing things that are not in the line of Moses, Ezra, and the scribes, etc. So that's one thing I wanted us to see. So now we get to Caesarea Philippi, which is not in Judea anymore. And he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? Son of Man could either be a human being, because Ezekiel is called a son of man, or the Son of Man could refer to the book of Daniel, and he's an apocalyptic figure. So it's hard to know which he means, but he's talking about himself. And notice this is what people think about Jesus at the time. Some say John the Baptist, right? And they had this idea, John the Baptist is dead by now. He's been killed by Herod, but you could actually come back from the dead. Elijah did, and so there's this view, well, maybe John the Baptist came back from the dead. Or others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. So how did the people around Jesus understand, how did the people of Jesus' day understand him? He's a prophet of repentance, and a pretty hard-nosed prophet of repentance, right? Jeremiah's a really scary guy. Elijah's a really scary guy, and John the Baptist is a really scary guy. Even now, the axe is laid to the root of the trees. Those that don't grow fruit will be thrown into the fire, right? That's John the Baptist. So the people of Jesus' time, according to the disciples, think that Jesus is a prophet of repentance and threat, actually, right? And if you don't repent, this is what's going to happen to you. I think that's fascinating, because if you ask people now, they would never associate Jesus with these people. But Jesus has been, to me, he's been domesticated, right? He turns into a really nice guy. But they found him to be very scary. And Jeremiah preached against the temple, right? So we'd have to see what Jesus says about the temple. So then he says to them, but who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. So that takes us back to, you are my beloved Son, okay? And the Messiah. The only person we've heard called the Messiah since the Davidic kingdom is Cyrus. And Cyrus freed the exiles from Babylon and sent them back and rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. So if you're the Messiah, you're going to free the exiles or gather the scattered people of Israel into one, and you're going to preserve or rebuild the temple, right? Or purify the temple. So those would be the meanings of being the Messiah at this time. Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah, so he doesn't deny it, right? Just don't tell anyone. But from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, which they would expect, and undergo great suffering at the hand of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you. Why? Why does Peter say that? Is he crazy or is he right? If you're an Israelite, should the Son of God be killed in Jerusalem? Like, what's supposed to happen when the Son of God goes into Jerusalem?
Safety.
Pardon me?
Safety, like sanctuary.
Yeah, he'll be the one who saves it, right, from their enemies. And the enemies now would be Rome, right? So if he's the Son of God, the Messiah, he should go into Jerusalem and create safety there, right? And can he be killed if he's the son of David? No. David will always get the better of his enemies, right? That was the whole point. And so Peter's not wrong. Peter's like, what are you talking about, right? He rebukes him, and the only time I think that the term rebuke is used in the New Testament is about demons, that Jesus rebukes demons and tells them to come out. And so by rebuking Jesus, he's basically saying, you're possessed. I mean, what the heck happened to you, right? And so go forth, unclean spirit, right? But then Jesus turns to Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. Now, we haven't seen Satan before either. So the devil is a new thing as well. But who's possessed? Jesus or Peter? It's Peter, right? And so by saying, no, you can't, this can never happen to you, you're possessed. Even though the reason he's saying that is, very good one, how can the Davidic king be killed in Jerusalem? Right? And notice, and on the third day be raised, this kind of disappears because it's like, no, you're going to go in and be killed? No, that's never going to happen to you. So it's really interesting. And then Jesus says to them, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Right? So if you think that the Messiah means you're never going to be killed by your enemies, you're wrong. That's a human thing. Even though that's what God says to David and in Psalm 89. The enemies will never get the better of him. So it's really interesting. There's this kind of collision of expectations here. And then he told his disciples, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what does it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels, and here it is now the Daniel Son of Man, in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. For truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. That's an interesting thing to talk about now in the future, but right now I just want to, hold on just a sec, I just want to highlight one thing. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what were the Jews of Jesus' day willing to give up their lives? The law of Moses, right? And they're contemporary with Jesus and even after Jesus. They will willingly give up their lives to the Roman rulers who are going to defile the temple if it means they don't have to disobey the law of Moses. So they're willing to die for the law of Moses. And we hear them say that over and over again in the Maccabees. One cannot but choose to die at the hands of mortals and cherish the hope that God gives of being raised again by him. Or you curse, let me see. Oh yeah, you cursed wretch, talking to Antiochus, you dismiss us from this present life, but the King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life, we'll find our lives again, because we have died for his laws. Right, so Jesus is saying, your devotion to him trumps your devotion to Moses. You should be willing to die for me, not for Moses, or not for God's law in Moses. That's a huge shift. And notice also, it's making suffering and dying for him normative. Right? You take up your cross, you will be executed if you follow me. And if you don't, if you're not willing to suffer and die, you're not following me. Right? That is not Moses. Moses does not say, suffer and die for me. Can you imagine? It would almost make your hair fall out if Moses said, lose yourself for my sake. Right? But he wouldn't say that. And also, the whole idea that the suffering now is what is expected, right? So Jesus going to Jerusalem and suffering and dying at the hands of his enemies is going to happen to the disciples as well. If they hate me, they're going to hate you, he says. The disciple is not above the master. If they kill the master, they're going to kill you. If they hate me, they're going to hate you. And so this oppositional thinking and suffering the opposition of others is normative now, according to Jesus. It's not just an exception that arises every now and then. I'm sorry, though, you had a question. I didn't want to.
Yeah, I just want to say, wouldn't the Son of Man be translation?
All this is
The Son of
translation.
Man gets understanding. So wouldn't that be a translation of what the Son of Man is?
Well, the Son of Man's a tricky term because it could either, it shows up in two, I mean, it's obviously an English translation of the Greek or the Hebrew.
Disrespect the Son of Man, you would wish you'd never been born, and you wouldn't get the understanding, then you'd be stuck.
Oh, that could
without
be.
Understanding in
Right.
translation.
No, that could, yeah, that could be.
Okay. I was just not really a question, just making a.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. No, so if you want to understand what's really going on, you have to follow the Son of Man, right? But the Son of Man will also be your judge. So the Son of Man is going to come back in your lifetime, notice, right? No, there are some, not everyone, but in some of their lifetimes, the Son of Man will come back and judge whether or not you took up your cross and followed him, right? So he's both the way and the judge if you followed the way. So it's a very interesting move that is different. I mean, Moses never says, and I'm going to come back and check on you at the end of time, right? So you have this very different, and that's also a form of authority, right? It's a form of divine authority, which goes to the earlier question about what he's claiming to be. So that's about as far as we're going to get, but this Caesarea Philippi is really kind of the gospel in a nutshell, which is why I put it in. So if you read the rest of it, you'll see Jesus' entry to Jerusalem. He's celebrated as the son of David, and his kingdom is coming. And then he goes into the temple, which is exactly what you'd expect the son of David to do. And then there's this whole contested saying, tear this temple down, and I will rebuild it, or rebuild one not made by human hands. In the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that's something the false witnesses say. In the Gospel of John, that's something Jesus says, right? And so, did he say it? That's a really interesting question. And is Jesus a friend or an enemy of the temple is kind of an interesting question. When he dies, when he's dying on the cross, they return to this saying. They deride him, saying, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Okay, there's one. So that saying is clearly associated with Jesus, not just by the false witnesses. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. Because if you're the Son of God, doesn't mean you're divine. Your enemies can't beat you. So if God loves you, you can come down from the cross. Why are you being crucified? Right? Because David was never defeated like that. Saul was defeated like that, but David was not. So you see these ideas all coming together toward the end of his life as well. Temple, law, son of David. And those are the three issues, at least in the Gospel of Matthew, that are really, really important that they're playing on, right? And Moses, the law, etc. So anyway, I hope this is, I didn't mean to go too long, but I hope this is interesting. We'll come back to some of this next time and then turn to the Apostle Paul, who is actually writing his letters before the Gospels get written. So he's actually an earlier voice than the Gospel of Matthew. So anyway, thank you for coming this morning, and I hope to see you next week. So thank you.